Hello, everyone. Sorry if the audio dropped out there. I was just finishing my housekeeping announcements, asking that you all provide us some feedback on this webinar. At the end of the webinar, a window should pop up with a couple questions, and we want to hear about what you thought of the presentation, the data, and just your main takeaways and any questions you still have. I'm Caitlin Donnelly, the program director from Nonprofit Vote. If you've been to our webinar series before, you've seen me. You'll see less of me today because we have some really great presentations and panelists. So we're going to start this webinar, Who are the Nonprofits that do voter engagement, by talking about the data from our recently released report, America's Nonprofits Get Out the Vote. So we will put the link to that report if you have not seen it in the chat. We also welcome you all to introduce yourself. Where are you joining us from? What organization do you work with? We're really happy to have you here. So after that presentation about the report and the data and findings, we'll jump into our panel, which I think will be really exciting. We have joining us nonprofit leaders from CalNonprofits, United Way Worldwide, and Cleveland Votes. And that panel will be moderated by our own Brian Miller, the Executive Director of Nonprofit Vote. So I don't want to hold the floor any longer than I have to because it's really great information today. Just a reminder, again, we are recording this webinar. It's being live streamed. The recording will be sent to you along with these data slides and a link to the report. So you can watch your inbox for that probably early next week. And please do use our Q&A box if you have any questions for our presenters or panelists. So I am going to take it right over to Caroline Mack, our evaluation and learning manager at Nonprofit Vote, to walk us through the findings. Thanks, Caroline.
Thanks, Caitlin. So today I'll be walking you through just the top level findings of the report. You can find the full report and follow along on our homepage or at this link, nonprofitvote.org/AmericasNonprofitsGOTV. This report is the first to publish sector-specific figures around nonprofit voter engagement. I know I'm always struggling to find research specific to nonprofits, so it was very exciting when we found a way to have a national-wide look at the following two questions for the first time ever. The two key questions we've always wanted to answer are, what % of nonprofits are doing voter engagement, and who are these nonprofits? We were able to answer this because of a key new survey that was released just this past year by the Urban Institute. In the spring of 2021, the Urban Institute did a nationwide survey of nonprofits. Primarily, it was originally to understand the impact of COVID on nonprofit finances, but has become much more than that. They released a data set that the public could use, which contains anonymized responses to all the survey questions they asked. This data set also has a unique sector-wide look because they were randomly selected from the IRS 990s. So of the 2,400 nonprofits originally surveyed, 266 were given a question about GOTV/voter engagement activity. Using the 229 that answered it, we did descriptive statistics and statistical testing on factors that increased the likelihood of voter engagement, like Pearson's chi-square test and Fisher's exact test. In these statistical tests, it's perfectly fine to have a total group of 200 or so, as long as comparison group sizes are larger than a certain number. In our analysis, they all did, and also in addition to the trends that you see today, all findings were tested as statistically significant in their correlation to increased voter engagement activity. Feel free to ask more questions about this in the chat or in the Q&A box as I cover the data. And thanks to Louis Falk and Marie Kim for their collaboration assistance. They were the Urban Institute team. So here's the original question that the nonprofits received in this survey. During the last 2 years, How often did your organization conduct get out the vote activities? E.g., help people register to vote, voter education, voting access. The options that these nonprofits had were never, rarely, occasionally, frequently, and almost all the time. Using this question and all the other demographic information that the survey provided, here are the key findings that we found. To the question of what percent of nonprofits were doing voter engagement, we found that 20% of surveyed nonprofits said that they did voter engagement at least occasionally to all the time in the past 2 years, starting from 2020. To the question of who are these nonprofits doing voter engagement, we found that nonprofits who serve underrepresented communities, like low income or people of color, did voter engagement at higher rates than that 20% average. We also found that percentages substantially increased for nonprofits that had people of color in leadership. So in the first charts I'm about to show you, I'll show you how we got to this finding and another way we looked at nonprofits serving communities in need. In this chart, it shows us that nonprofits that primarily focus services on underrepresented communities are more likely to do voter engagement. The vertical axis and percentages represent the percentage of nonprofits who said they did voter engagement occasionally to all the time by community served. The purple bars you see here represent the nonprofits who indicated that they primarily serve a certain population, and the white bars represent nonprofits who said that the population was not a group of focus for them. And when we looked at nonprofits that served Black communities, Hispanic, and low-income communities, nonprofits that were primarily serving these groups were doing voter engagement at 35%, 34%, and 29%, all about 10 to 15 percentage points more than that 20% average. In the next chart, we looked at another way that nonprofits serve communities of need. This chart shows us that nonprofits providing key support services to communities are more likely to do voter engagement. Again, the percentages represent nonprofits who said that they do voter engagement occasionally to all the time, but this time by services. You can see here in the purple bars, nonprofits who indicated that they provide services around food and nutrition, community improvement and capacity building, both do voter engagement at a rate of 37%. Also, nonprofits who give job training and employment services, youth development, 32, 35, and 32%. All both at least 10 percentage points higher than the sector average of 20%. So going back to our other key finding. In the next charts, you'll see the findings that showed us that nonprofits with people of color in leadership are also doing voter engagement at substantially higher rates. First, we looked at the board composition of these nonprofits. In this chart, it shows us that nonprofits with a higher percentage of people of color on boards are more likely to do voter engagement. Again, the percentages are the nonprofits who said they do voter engagement occasionally to all the time, but this time by the board composition of people of color. So the three groups we looked at were nonprofits with a board of over 50% people of color, nonprofits with a board of 20 to 50% people of color, and nonprofits with less than 20% people of color board. And so as you can see that those nonprofits that had most POCs on their board, 39% engagement, almost 40%, which is double 20% average, had the most engagement, voter engagement. In comparison, the nonprofits that had only 20 to 50% of POCs on their board were about the sector average at 24%, and then those that had less than 20% of a POC board were under the sector average at 15%. So next, we looked at CEOs. We found that nonprofits with a CEO of color are more likely to do voter engagement. The percentages represent those by CEO race doing voter engagement occasionally to all the time. But this time we grouped nonprofits that said that they had Black CEOs, Hispanic CEOs, API, Native American, multiracial, or other CEOs. And as you can see, with the average, nonprofits with a POC CEO had a voter engagement rate of 39%, which is, again, almost 40, almost double the 20% sector average. And when we didn't, in comparison, white CEOs had an engagement rate of 15%, which is under the sector average. And so when we didn't average the engagement rates of POC CEOs, we found that nonprofits with a Hispanic or Black CEO are doing voter engagement at even higher rates. So you can see that 50%, almost half of nonprofits with Hispanic CEOs are doing voter engagement, and almost half of nonprofits with Black CEOs are doing voter engagement. So lastly, here are some other findings you can find in our report that we thought showed an interesting picture of who these nonprofits are. So here are some further findings. Nonprofits that were more likely to do voter engagement were involved in lobbying or advocacy. They are often located in urban areas versus suburban or rural, and they have budgets of $500,000 or more. This isn't to say that nonprofits that weren't in these or not doing these things didn't do voter engagement, they were just less likely to. And then factors that were not statistically significant, so these didn't show any particular trends of more likely or not likely for nonprofits doing voter engagement, was the gender of the CEO, whether the state was a battleground state or had a competitive election according to the 2020 Electoral College ratings, and then also the cost of voting, which is a state-by-state estimate based on like restrictive or voting-friendly policies. When we looked at these factors using regression tests, statistical significance, and also just bar charts, these factors didn't have as clear trends or conclusions as you saw earlier. And we're excited to, continue looking at these things as this report continues over the years. So in this last chart, you can see the first finding from that previous slide that was saying nonprofits involved in lobbying or advocacy are more likely to do voter engagement. And so all of these organizations, again, the percent is the voter engagement rate that they report, but this time by advocacy activity. And so these organizations that are educating the public about issues of interest, lobbying policy makers directly, they work with organizations to conduct advocacy, all of these are doing voter engagement at a higher rate than the sector average. And so to me, all of these findings suggest that these nonprofits particularly understand the value of voter engagement impact on their work. I will say that I was really surprised when I saw the 20% average, because I actually thought it was much lower. And previous studies told us it was like 6 or 10%, but they weren't nationwide. So I'll let the panelists weigh in on just a few minutes on that. So the last thing I'll share is an invitation. This was the first year that Urban Institute did their survey and the first year that we did this report. We hope to continue monitoring that 20%, see if it increases, and all the trends of nonprofits who are doing it more often and less often, as we try to increase the voter education that voters of these nonprofits get. And as we think about next questions for further research, we're thinking about, why do nonprofits do voter engagement? What kinds of voter engagement are nonprofits doing? And you can help us start answering that today. So as we start transitioning to the panel, if you're comfortable, put in the chat why you do voter engagement and what kinds you do. Thanks everyone, and turning it to our panelist moderator and report author, Brian.
All right. Took me a second to find the mute button. Thank you, Caroline. Really appreciate that excellent presentation on the data findings, which, as Caroline noted, we spent a lot of time looking at these numbers over the past few months. Caroline was instrumental in putting this research report together. So again, thank you to Caroline. Thank you to the team at Urban Institute for the initial survey. I'm going to start by introducing our panelists, and the panelists can go ahead and turn your cameras on, if you would, and introduce, starting with Lindsay Torrico. Lindsay Torrico, you raise your hand so people see which one you are. There you go, that's Lindsay. Lindsay is the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at United Way Worldwide. Lindsay fights to improve education, increase job opportunities, and empower individuals to be active and engaged members in their communities. Thank you, Lindsay, for being a part of this panel.
Thank you.
Next, we have Jan Masaoka, and Jan is the CEO of the California Association of Nonprofits, aka CalNonprofits, which is a statewide policy alliance of more than 10,000 nonprofits speaking to government, philanthropy, and the public at large. And we really appreciate, Jan, your being a part of this discussion today. And lastly, we have Erika Anthony. Erika is the co-founder and executive director of Cleveland Votes. Cleveland Votes is a nonpartisan democracy building and mobilization entity that aims to strengthen the civic muscle and power of the nonprofit sectors to ensure we have a more informed, participatory, and cohesive community. So Erika, thank you again for being a part of this discussion. And you all just saw the data. Of course, you read the report previously. And Lindsay, I'll go and start with you. What is it, when you look at this report and you see the data presentation that Caroline presented in your previous readings, what surprised you about this research, and did anything confirm some assumptions you already had or affirm the work that you've seen out in the space?
Thanks, Brian, and thank you all at Nonprofit Vote for hosting this conversation. It is so important that we are talking about this, particularly as the midterm elections are underway. Primaries have already started. And so we're so grateful for your research and your leadership on this issue. You know, I think in terms of the report, for me, it was not surprising. I think it confirmed assumptions, but it's really good to have the data to back up the assumptions that I have. I think anecdotally, I noticed that there was a growing interest and really a groundswell of engagement and momentum around the 2020 elections and around the 2020 census as well. So to see that so many nonprofits engaged in that work, particularly those that had not engaged in the past, is really great and remarkable. I think the question is, how do we sustain that, and how do we engage the other 80% of nonprofits that are not involved? But it does give us a lot of good data on who is engaged, what are the variables and factors that are influencing their engagement. And I think that will help inform how we engage the rest of the folks that are not involved in this space. I would also say that I think the fact that there's a high correlation between BIPOC-led nonprofits and voter engagement, to me, was like a duh. That just, it was not an aha. I think for many of us, this seems very obvious that people of color, leaders of nonprofits, are more engaged in this work. But again, I think the question is, how do we make the case for white CEOs, particularly those that are serving communities that are often historically disenfranchised, that have been underserved? How do we make the case for them that they need to be just as involved in this and just as committed to this work? And so I think there are questions that this raises for us. I think we have a lot more work to do, but it gives us, I think, some guidelines and some guardrails on where we should focus. And Brian, I don't think I can hear you. I don't know if it's just on my end.
You are right. I had muted.
There we go. Okay.
Erika, any reactions from your end, things that you found surprising in the data, or things that perhaps affirmed or confirmed assumptions that you already had?
Thank you. And thank you again to Nonprofit Vote for hosting this webinar today. I can echo many of the sentiments that Lindsay shared as well, so I'll try not to repeat. But I would say, globally, I was affirmed by the data. I think, when you're in the field as a practitioner, you have your own lived experience with your network or your community. So it was really helpful to be able to see the broader picture as a result of this study and the research findings that you all have shared with us. From our, I think Cleveland lens and perspective of Cleveland Votes, it was very affirming, particularly the data point around leaders of color and their engagement. When we think about our network of partners, I would say majority of those individual organizations are led by persons of color and or have persons of color in the leadership position. And I know we'll get more into this throughout the conversation, but I think it's really important to honor and uphold lived experience and the connectivity that some individual leaders have when it comes to voting rights and just the historical nature of those that have been marginalized and disenfranchised from equitably accessing the ballot. So I think coming from that lens and perspective, it is in fact affirming, and I think it's an invitation for both white CEOs as well as other CEOs that are not actively engaged. And we know that this is part of why this conversation is happening today. People come into this space at different journeys and sort of different pathways. And I think we have to honor, folks' comfort level and where they are. But I think this at least gives a good grounding to start that conversation. This is a long journey. Unfortunately, I think we're in an industry that, is pretty secure, where we're not going anywhere anytime soon. So we have a lot of time to engage other type of nonprofits, again, who are not currently involved, but really allow this data and this report to be an invitation to join us in the path to equitable democracy.
Thank you, Erika. And Erika, I actually have a follow-up question that I want to ask you, because I know with your work at Cleveland Votes, a good bit of the work that you've done is outreaching to folks in the community. You're recruiting sites to participate in voter registration programs, including sites from a myriad of nonprofits. When I saw the data about the community served, the leadership, and I think this is an important conversation we're picking up on. One, the people of color in leadership position is clearly important in the data, but as is the community that the nonprofit serves, if they're serving communities of color, if they're serving low-income communities. I have asserted, and from our conversations, when we talk about reasons nonprofits do voter engagement, part of it is a recognition of a need in the community that they're representing. And is this part of the conversations when you're recruiting in site selection, when you're selecting which sites participate in your program? Is this part of the conversation that you have with them?
Yeah, most certainly. I think we do our best to lead with as much authenticity about whose lived experience are we trying to uphold, right? So, we as an entity are maybe a small organization, but the network of partners that we have across our city really represent almost every nook and cranny here in the city of Cleveland. And for us, it's really important to base all of our engagement in relationship and trust, right? I am not an individual that identifies with the Latinx community. That doesn't mean I can't work with and or be in partnership with individuals that are in our Latinx community. But I think it's more authentic for us to partner with organizations either that are in service to or working directly with individuals in our community. And that could be applied to our AAPI community as well as our Black community. So we really try to identify organizations that have an established relationship. And when organizations do not, we really recommend that they work with and partner with those that are already either place-based in that organization or in that particular neighborhood, or have relationships in that neighborhood. So we had a nonprofit that was looking to engage our Latinx residents about 2 years ago. I think this was in 2020. And they, had not previously done work in that particular community. And rather than starting from scratch, we recommended that they connect with a partner that we had already been working with just to strengthen that relationship and also for them to establish trust with the individuals in that neighborhood. So it's really important to have the trust and the relationships and lead with authenticity and understanding that there are nuances and there are challenges that maybe I can't speak to from my lens and perspective, but building a network of organizations that can represent multiple perspectives, not just based upon race, but also working with organizations that may work with individuals with disabilities, understanding the impediments for those that are sight or hearing impaired, and making sure that we're making our practices and our programs equitable in that way.
Thank you, Erika. Jan, you've read the report, you've seen the presentation from Caroline. When you first saw it, what did you find surprising in the data, if anything? And what did you find affirming or reinforcing of something perhaps you sort of assumed but didn't see the numbers about?
I was hoping you were going to ask me about my sticker, which says, I work for a nonprofit and I vote. And I just wanted to say they're a big campaign of ours during election years. And, I thought that I wanted to say also thanks to you and Caitlin for organizing this and inviting us to be part of it. And I think that I feel I like Lindsay's characterization, kind of like, duh. We know that activist kind of organizations are more likely to be involved with voter work, and activist organizations are more likely to be part of marginalized communities, not only people of color, but disabled communities, LGBT, etc. So I think that in that way, I think that there wasn't something surprising. I think a couple things though. Caroline was Caroline was very nice to answer my question about in one of the very first slides that said like what were the factors that seemed to have a significant correlation to higher work, and the three were Black-led or Black-serving, Black-led, Hispanic, and low income. And so I asked her about Asian Americans. Here in San Francisco, Asian Pacific population is 30% of the population, for example. And she said wasn't statistically significant. And I think so. I think maybe one of my questions or discussions should be that maybe at the finding of the report, the headline maybe would be more appropriate to say Black and Hispanic organizations as opposed to people of color organizations. That we and that because I think that's something significant to say, that they're not all lumped together. And I think so anyway, that's one of the things I was thinking about. And then I think the other comment I want to make is a lot of the variables like budget size, for example, and suburban, et cetera. I think that, those struck me as variables that are often used in management surveys, right? Like if you're trying to figure out which nonprofits, don't have updated personnel manuals, those are the kinds of questions. And on the other hand, if let's say we were thinking about this for a political candidate, we were working for a political candidate or a particular cause, I think some of the questions that I'd also be interested in would be in red or blue states, for example. Does it correlate or discorrelate with high voting percentages or low voting percentages? Is there a Democratic or a Republican governor? And do they engage in other kinds of advocacy activities, and which ones? And then, so I would just be interested in that.
Thank you, Jan. And I appreciate your point about the API data. That was one of the unfortunate things, is the survey wasn't big enough. We've certainly made the case to Urban Institute that this question that forms the basis of this research be included in the full survey, because the full survey is almost 2,400 respondents. And that may give us a big enough data set to report out more numbers than we weren't able to report because of the size of the data. There was another data point, and I think both you and Erika mentioned communities with disabilities. That was another area, and we almost were able to include it in the report, but it fell below our threshold for statistical significance. But we showed that if a nonprofit primarily served disability communities, there were 32% were likely to do voter engagement work. Again, well above the 20% average, but it didn't meet our threshold for significance. But I think there are some suggestions in the data that a lot of communities out there are strong, who the community is that the nonprofit's serving is a strong driver in determining that nonprofit's commitment to doing voter engagement work. And so thank you. I want to switch back to we've kind of already been talking about this, but I know this has been sort of the central theme of the conversation, but I'll go and restate the question here and add a little nuance to it. We found that inclusion of people of color in the organization's board, staff, and executive leadership strongly correlate with higher rates of voter engagement. And I think you've all said that what you make of it, but I guess one question is, how can the sector be more supportive of these diverse leaders, of these leaders who are really at the front line of this fight and doing this work? And I've seen a lot of research about how, BIPOC-led nonprofits don't get quite the same level of funding. But how do we make sure that the nonprofits that are actively doing this work are getting supported for that important voter engagement work? And I'll pick anyone, whoever wants Jan, your hand went up.
Sure. I'd like to differentiate between organizations that are led by people of color and organizations that are deeply part of and come from a community of color. I really am unhappy with the fact that the sector tends to blur that and use them almost the same way. Because, for example, you know, the Ford Foundation is led by a Black man, but it's not an African American organization, right? And so I think when we look at these, I think our emphasis in California is kind of more to focus on the organizations that are parts of communities of color, right? And I think a lot of times one of the reasons why they're important is because in today's society, those organizations are not just service or not just policy organizations. They become brokers of political power for those communities. So for example, in the olden days, you know, if a mayor, let's say, wanted to find out, you know, wanted to sort of make some kind of a deal or test out an idea on the Asian American community or the Chinese community, let's say, you know, that mayor would probably have reached out to people from some of the big family associations or some of the big business people in Chinatown. Today, they will reach out to Chinatown Housing, Chinatown Economic Development. And that is absolutely true in every community of color, that these organizations rise to that position. And so I think that thinking about these organizations not just as voting or not voting, but as brokers of political power, then it makes complete sense why voting would be part of their toolkit and the kind of work that they're doing. Because one of the things elected officials and candidates want to know is how many people are going to listen to you about who to vote for.
Thank you, Jen. I'm happy to jump in here. I think, you know, when we think about driving participation from our peers, for me, it's about accountability and actualizing our words into action. I think what we have seen over the last at least 2 years, but we can go back before that for sure, is a lot of energy and commitment in the form of words around supporting some of the issues that we are experiencing in our communities, whether it relates to the global pandemic of COVID or the racial uprisings. However, I think we're starting to see in the more recent times, not sort of consistency in how those words are translating into practice, right? I had a conversation just this week with a coalition here in Ohio working on fighting back on some bills at our state house, and they were reaching out to me and another colleague, essentially to seeking some thought leadership and you know, sort of in the code of brain trust with some colleagues around strategizing, and specifically strategizing around how to bring in some of our corporate and philanthropic leaders into the fold for this particular issue. And they were frustrated, to say the least. And I think some of the frustration stemmed from the fact that some of the institutions that they were approaching, asking for their support to fight back against this bill, are some of the same institutions that have, in fact, in the last 2 years, declared racism a public health crisis, as an example, right? And really wanting those organizations to not just say those words, but actually believe those words, actualize those words, and demonstrate their action. And again, this is just one bill, not saying that it all falls on this one bill, but really trying to create that space that, you know, the act of voting is just one part of the equation, right? When we think about a more healthy community, a more equitable democracy, it's an entire equation that we have to think about. And it's not just a one-off instance, right? It's really about, what is the mission of my organization? How am I trying to strengthen and move the constituents or the clients that I'm working with to a place where they're thriving, right? So if I am an organization that is serving organizations that are individuals that have been historically disenfranchised, how am I leading with efficacy and understanding that it's not just about the service delivery, but really thinking about the entire equation of strengthening our democracy, right? So I think it is a call to action. That's why we're here today. I think for us too, it's really important to acknowledge that, again, not everyone is coming into this conversation with the same level of knowledge or experience. So we try to provide a roadmap, right? And really honor the fact that people may enter into this work in different ways. They may have varying levels of capacity from their staff capacity or their budget constraints. So really trying to give people different pathways to enter into this space, both from a no budget to, a super fancy budget, those that have more resources to expend. And we have created a number of reports, a number of toolkits at Cleveland Votes, again, with the effort of sharing this information in a way that allows individuals and organizations to see the different ways that they can step into this space.
Erika, thank you for bringing that up. And I want to circle back to the budget question in a second, because that was one of the data findings that came out, as you saw earlier. There's sort of a threshold, it seems. But before I get that, I want to just one more question around the whole issue around race and leadership. And it's really like, on the flip side, organizations with less, diverse leadership, especially organizations with white CEOs or majority white boards that are serving historically underrepresented communities. What would your message be to those leaders to encourage them to more fully engage the communities that they serve? And Lindsay, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll step in here. And first, I want to just acknowledge and say I appreciate Jan and Erika's comments earlier, because, especially on the heels of Black History Month, we saw so many brands, so many nonprofits and companies talk about their commitment to supporting Black communities. But at the end of the day, what are you doing? What funding are you putting towards addressing a lot of these systemic issues through voting and other, equitable policies? So I think we have to push them as consumers of some of these products and as partners with them to really to do the work with us, right? But I think in terms of white CEOs, what I would say is, I've seen that there are really three key messages that are important for that, for those nonprofits that are led by white CEOs. One is we've got to help them connect the mission of their organization to the work of voter engagement. And for all of us, it seems very obvious, right, that all of the issues that impact communities are undergirded by access to democracy, access to having political power, right? So there's an obvious connection, but I think for a lot of white CEOs, they don't fully understand, well, how does me working at a food bank get connected to work around voter engagement? So we have to help them be really explicit about, here's how you make that clear connection, right? With your board, with your supporters, so that you can really step into the work and see that it's mission aligned, right? I think the second thing is educating them on how to do this in a nonpartisan way. I think there's a lot of misinformation about what nonprofits can and cannot do. And unfortunately, I think a lot of boards in particular hide behind, well, we don't want to be partisan, so clearly we don't want to take a position on any policy issues or do any civic engagement work. I think we have to educate them and almost over-educate them on, yes, absolutely, you can do this work, and here's how you can do it in a way that is not partisan. And I think third is talking about the bottom line, and we saw that in the survey results. Funding is a big barrier for a lot of nonprofits, so we've got to help them with resources, tell them how they can fund this work, and how it can also help them potentially get more funding for the organization. So I think those are three key ways that we've been able to persuade and convince and make the case for a lot of our white CEOs that this is work that they should do and absolutely can do, but they need some, some guidance and support and some, they need all of us to kind of push them to do it.
Can I comment?
Erika, Jan, I don't know if either one of you have anything you want to add. Jan, looks like you're about to say something.
That, I guess I'm a little uncomfortable with the idea of how should we talk to white CEOs as if that would be like our focus point. I mean, to me, one of the issues is a little bit less the percentage of nonprofits that are doing voter work, but the number of people they're reaching. Because frankly, you know, if we get 3 more nonprofits to do voter work and each of them have 2 staff and a constituency of 50 each, or do we get 3 nonprofits that have 500 staff and have constituencies of 4,000 people a month that are coming into their clinic site? So, I mean, we know with voting that, you know, percentages matter, but number of votes matters a lot. And I think we need to take that message into this kind of work. So I think that, I mean, to me, I think that, you know, an example is some food banks think that they see themselves as service organizations, and some food banks see themselves as fighting hunger. And you can't, I think a lot of times those two differentiations, which one is which, doesn't necessarily break down easily by demographics or other things. So, I mean, to me, I think that kind of the message, which I think Lindsay was getting at, is kind of to say to people, you know, do you care about autism? Then it matters who's in office. You know, do you care, you know, do you care about state parks? Do you care about Ukrainian folk music, right? All of these things, it matters who's in office. And we can even disagree about which candidate might be better at helping elders than another, but at least we're both voting with that in mind. I think that's why kind of our Vote With Your Mission campaign is that idea. And I think lastly, you know, what's the easiest way to get any CEO to be super interested in anything? Hey, would you like to have $25,000 to work on voter engagement? I mean, I just feel like let's not spend huge amounts of time trying to convince people that they should, when all you have to do is put out grant funding. And that's why I really feel like Erika's point about how can we convince the funding community or shame the funding community or whatever it takes, right? To fund this kind of work is actually really the strategic question, because everyone will become interested if there's funding available for it.
And
I would just, if
go
I
ahead.
can just really quickly, you know, I think also not thinking about our work of civic and voter engagement in isolation. There has to be a holistic approach to understanding, you know, both what we've talked about, the leadership, who is being served by these organizations, and we can't isolate the conversation about, you know, whether or not an organization is led by a person of color or led by a white CEO to what else that organization is doing. They shouldn't just be thinking about diversifying their staff composition for purposes of, you know, getting more folks engaged in the voting process, but they should want to do that, right? And there's plenty of other studies that we're not here to talk about today that talk about the value of that. And I think for me, it's really about the transformation versus the transaction, right? What are you seeking to do ultimately as a nonprofit? And as Jan, which is alluding to, there's not an issue that I can think of that is not impacted by democracy, that is not impacted by who is representing them in Congress, in their state house, in their local municipality, right? So it's a value proposition, it's a holistic approach, and it's really about being transformative and not transactional.
I want to throw out one theory just to get folks' reaction, and we'll move to some questions from the audience. And maybe this is a way of tying it together, is that, like, I think part of the challenge that we face with the nonprofits that aren't doing it is that sometimes, I guess, they're wearing almost like clinical blinders that are looking purely at the service that they're providing. And I think when you start talking about the lived experience that people have, that leaders of color have, they know the other realities, and it's easier to take those clinical blinders off and see the holistic challenges that the communities are facing. And so I guess it's like, how do you get folks to take off those blinders and take a bigger view of the community and the services that they're providing? Or as Jan, you said, you know, moving from addressing to fighting hunger, moving from feeding people to fighting hunger, you know. And any thoughts on that?
Well, there's a great comment I was just going to mention in the chat about this whole idea, is that it's, you know, it's rooted in how does the organization see themselves, how the CEO sees the work. Is it about addressing systemic issues, or is it about sort of those, I don't want to say Band-Aid solutions, but those kind of near-term needs? And I think the challenge for a lot of CEOs that are working at food banks or other places is that there are so many, the needs are overwhelming. And so it's not necessarily that they don't see the bigger picture, But if they're just constantly putting out fires and just trying to stay on top of all the needs and communities, it can be really difficult to think about our larger work, our larger mission. So I think, to Jan's point, I think it's about providing the funding, providing the capacity, providing the guidance on how to do that. Because I think for many of them, if you sat down and had a conversation with them about this is about addressing long-term solutions, many of them would understand that, but they're bogged down by many just urgent needs. And so giving them the capacity and the funding to be able to do that work, I think will make a real difference.
Okay.
And I would just add, I've had the honor of serving in pseudo philanthropic roles, an emphasis on pseudo. So I've never worked for a foundation directly, but I ran and led a funding collaborative, and Cleveland Votes also provides funding. So having the lens and perspective into these pseudo philanthropic roles, I think it's also important. I know there's historical nature into the operation of philanthropic organizations, and sort of sometimes the overburden that staff may feel by being in their specific portfolio or issue area. And I think you're starting to see some foundations understanding that there's fluidity, right? It's not just about having a voter engagement or civic engagement portfolio or democracy building portfolio like we have here in some of our foundations, but whether you're leading arts and culture, whether you're leading work around workforce, whether you're leading work around education, all of that translates to wanting your organizations, your grantees to be involved in the democracy building efforts, right? But that has to be said, that has to be supported, that has to be invested in, that has to be sustained, right? So if an organization is being a recipient of a grant for XYZ services, they should not be expected to, on top of that, also try to figure out how they, integrate some type of voter engagement or civic engagement work. So it's really about the efficacy of what we're asking and often, sort of the burden that we're putting on organizations and making sure that there's equity in how they're being funded.
We're talking about funding. I'll go ahead and jump to the first question here, which we have from the audience is, I want to know those nonprofits who are being funded for voter engagement. I know that few in this state actually are engaged, but many are receiving funding for it. I'm not sure if I understand the question. I know few in the state are actually getting funding. Well, I guess what are the types of groups that you see getting the funding for it, I think is what the question is getting at. Who's getting the funding for the voter engagement work and where is it going to? And is it going to the right place?
I think it varies. I can only speak to Ohio in this case. We've seen fluctuations. There was a period of time where we were squarely deemed a swing state. Things have shifted definitely in the last couple of years. So I think, not to speak on behalf of other organizations, but I think there's a global acknowledgement that we are not seeing the same level of national funding coming to Ohio. I think we have great in-state foundations, but always room to grow. And that looks different for different communities throughout the state of Ohio. So for Cleveland, we have an amazing foundation, the George Gunn Foundation, that has been leading, I would say, in this space well before many other foundations were, not just in Ohio. And I think they are continuing to agitate gently, maybe, their peers across Ohio to think about and consider how they can make investments in our type of organizations. But I think it does vary state to state. And I think, again, the distinguishing factor that we've been talking about, organizations that are service-oriented, service-serving oriented organizations versus those that are squarely in the advocacy and activist space, definitely, sort of vary in the type of funding that they are receiving.
Yeah, I would just agree with Erika. I think, from what I've seen, it's organizations that have established relationships with other civic organizations and with their city and their state governments. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're an expert in working in this on these issues, but I think a great way to start is to kind of lean into the relationships you have in the communities, the partners that are already doing this work, that are experts in this, because those are the ones that are going to connect you to other funding opportunities, and give you credibility, right, to do this work. So I think having relationships with other civic organizations within the community is a great indicator of being able to get funding.
Okay, and I want to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about one. We actually have a foundation toolkit. Someone pointed this out to me, reminded me. We did a lot of work with the Council on Foundations and Independent Sector a couple of years back to put together a toolkit, a voter engagement toolkit for private foundations and a comparable one for public foundations that really gets into ways foundations can create space for grantees to do voter engagement work. And it does cover the direct funding we're talking here, provide grants, give people money to do the work, but it also gets into other things foundations can do, like host trainings for their grantees on staying nonpartisan or how to do voter engagement work. We partnered with the New Haven Community Foundation to host trainings for their grantees. We did a similar training for some grantees for the Atlanta Community Foundation. So foundations can be conveners of trainings, and they can also adjust their grant language to be less restrictive. And take out any unnecessary limitations that they might be including in their grant language. And so I think these are recognized issues, and there are voter engagement toolkit for private and community foundations. You can find it on our website. I want to circle back to one other question that we have here, which I think we've alluded to a couple of times there. Oh, thank you. Just paste it in the chat box so you can see the links for those toolkits in the chat box. We've done a lot of talk about, certain communities, low-income communities, communities of color, et cetera. Focusing on marginalized communities is important. However, it has been shown that these groups vote more on specific issues than on just the group identity. How can we better focus on issues in addition to group identity, or, tapping that? And I think we saw that in some of the earlier conversations and even some of the research, but anyone who wants to take that and speak to that, how do we shift and lift up some of these issues that people care about?
Well, it's a person who's gone door to door on every single election before the pandemic. One of the things you learn doing that, and I would encourage everybody on this call who doesn't do that to do that, because you learn so much, is that people don't vote based on policy analysis. Okay, that's what policy people, and a lot of us are policy people, would like to think. But I think people vote with how they see their values lining up with different positions and different kind of candidates. So, I mean, I think it's not so much, I think those are the things to speak to more in terms of people. And I think that that's why tying it to people's mission, again, if you're some Meals on Wheels are just about bringing food to people who need it, and some Meals on Wheels are about that, and also making sure that elderly people get services. And so identifying those Meals on Wheels, and it takes them almost no money and very little time to put a voter registration question on every single meal that they hand out, that they deliver. That's high impact in terms of numbers. And it's low impact in terms of the extra amount of time that it takes them, and asking people to vote not on the issues like, well, here's this thing that really parses the whole elderly thing differently, but instead say, this is what we stand for, is fighting for our services to the elderly, and these are the ballot propositions that are going to lead to that, and you decide which of the candidates is going to do the most for elderly.
I agree. And I think it's really important that, we connect the things that are most valuable to the residents in our community, or our clients or constituents, to what is going to be on the ballot or other organizing opportunities. So I agree with the person that provided this question. If I just scan, just in the last couple of years here in Cleveland, some amazing efforts. We had a successful passage of issue 24 on our ballot last November, which is primarily focused on police accountability. We've had had some grassroots organizing efforts to allow us to have public comment at our city hall. Before last year, we did not have the ability to provide public comment at city council meetings in 2021. It had not been the case for almost 100 years. We have folks that have been organizing around participatory budgeting and the ways in which we can reimagine how the ARPA dollars are used and who is part of the decision making. So all of these, to me, when I scan who's a part of these different coalitions and networks, represent our community. And I think it's really important to, yes, have the conversation about voting and turning out to vote, but people have to see the value in their day-to-day life. At the end of the day, if I don't see the value, then I'm not going to be motivated to vote, right? Even if my candidate is not on the ticket or that particular issue, it's about the continuity of engagement, the continuity of the relationship, and making sure that we're creating space for folks to activate in the way that best suits them and their families.
Thank you, Erika. And we're just a couple of minutes before the hour, so we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. And I have one quick question I'm going to ask you all to respond to as a way of closing out. And first off, before we get to this question, I want to thank you all again for being a part of this conversation and all your contributions to the space. And so just this quick round question to close us out. Let's imagine that this summer you are riding an elevator with a colleague at a conference and they say, quote, "You know, I'm just not sure that engaging voters is worth it for our organization." What would you tell them before you get off that elevator? Lindsay, you want to take it first?
I was hoping you wouldn't put me first, but okay. I think for me, I would say that we know that communities that have higher levels of voting are healthier. They have better quality of life. They're more resilient, more equitable. We know that there is a correlation between those two things. So if you care about your community, if you want your community to be the best community, the strongest community, then you're going to invest in this work. So I'll stop there. That's my pitch.
Jan, would you like to jump in?
I would say, why are we both in the same elevator during COVID times? I think I might say, did you hear that such and such foundation is giving grants of $10,000 to do voter engagement? You should really apply. And I think maybe one other thing to say would be, in the last presidential election, 67 electoral college votes were decided by less than 125,000 votes. Okay. And so what that says is, if you get 2 people to vote in your precinct, you're making a big difference. And I would also say not everybody needs to do this. When people ask me for political contributions personally, I say, I'm sorry, but I only give out of state, because some states are more important, I think, to get out the vote than California.
Erika, you're on the elevator. What do you say?
Well, first I would fix my face, because I'm sure I would be rolling my eyes if that person made that comment or asked that question. So after I fix my face, I think just echoing what Lindsay and Jan have said, I would just ask them what is most valuable to them. Are they committed to, seeing their residents, their constituents, their clients thriving? Beyond surviving? Are they committed to a healthy community, which includes a healthy democracy? If they are, then let's go. If not, according to Jan, peace out. We got other people we can talk to, right? Like, there are thousands and thousands of nonprofits, no shade, but I think we can't expend our energy in sort of banging our head for too long. We want to encourage as many people, obviously, to be a part of this fight and this liberation journey. But at the end of the day, there has to be some innate willingness from that person that they see the value proposition. We shouldn't have to convince them.
Lindsay, Jan, Erika, thank you all 3 for your participation in this discussion. Thank you for all the work you're doing in your respective communities and nationally. I'm going to close it out by turning it back over to Caitlin. If there's any closing announcements we need to make for folks regarding recordings and things like that. Caitlin.
Yeah, just keep an eye out on your email inbox. Early next week, we will get the recording and slides out. Thank you, everyone, so much. And please do take that survey on your way out. Thanks, and we'll see you on March 31st for our next webinar.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Brian, Caitlin.